Elvis Presley stood under the blue spotlights at the Las Vegas Hilton, December 2, 1976, gripping the mic with shaking hands. The crowd expected another love ballad, but instead, he confessed a truth he had hidden for years. "Always on My Mind" wasn't written for who everyone believed. The room froze, and everything changed. Inside the Las Vegas Hilton showroom, the air felt warm and shaky, as if every light carried its own heartbeat. Nearly 20,000 people filled the hall, waiting for Elvis to lift them into another world. Glasses clinked softly. A camera flashed near the back. Even from the stage, he felt their energy pressing forward like a rising wave. But backstage, guitarist James Burton had noticed something strange. Elvis kept touching a small folded note in his pocket, rubbing its worn edges as if the memory inside still cut him every time he felt it. He had carried that note for months. Some nights he ignored it. Other nights it tugged at him, reminding him of promises he wished he had kept. James never asked about it. He understood that even legends carried storms no one else could see. But the band felt the shift. The way Elvis moved slower. The way he breathed deeper. The way he stared into the crowd as if searching for one familiar face. What would you do if the one truth you feared most refused to stay hidden any longer? A soft buzz rolled through the speakers as the spotlights swept across the audience. Fans lifted scarves, ticket stubs, even old vinyl covers, hoping for a glance from the king. Yet, in that bright sea of faces, he somehow looked alone. The orchestra tuned quietly, strings humming like distant wind. Elvis's hand stayed near the note, as if it grounded him. What happens when a secret grows too heavy to carry, even for someone adored by millions? The crowd didn't know it yet, but something rare was about to happen. He stepped toward the mic, cleared his throat, and let his gaze drift slowly across the room. A woman in the front row nudged her friend and pointed at his shaking hands. Something felt different. The band sensed it too. They waited in complete stillness, as if one wrong sound might break him. James watched from behind, hoping Elvis would find his balance. But he didn't start with a smile. He didn't start with a joke. Instead, he reached into his pocket, touched the folded note, and closed his eyes. The lights dimmed, giving the room a softer glow. A hush fell over the crowd, so deep it felt like the building itself was listening. Elvis opened his eyes. For the first time that night, he didn't look like the world's biggest star. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a memory he couldn't outrun. James lifted his guitar, waiting for the usual nod. It never came. Elvis only stared ahead, as if someone from his past had stepped out of the dark and was now standing right in front of him. A faint buzz rose again from the speakers. A man near the balcony whispered, "Something's wrong." But no one moved. No one breathed. Elvis's hand pressed harder against the note, as if the truth written inside was pushing to escape. The air tightened. The room felt still. He lifted his head slowly, eyes shining under the spotlight. Whatever he was about to say wasn't planned, and the crowd felt it coming like a wave they couldn't stop. He finally opened his mouth. The room stayed frozen as Elvis gripped the microphone with both hands, knuckles turning pale under the lights. A soft tremble ran through his voice before he even spoke. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted, something raw. The stage felt strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. What would you have done if you were standing there, with 20,000 people waiting for your next breath? A woman in the front row whispered. He looked scared. Her voice carried farther than she meant, because no one else was talking. Elvis's eyes drifted downward, unfocused, almost haunted. He wet his lips, took a shaky breath, and then whispered the words that made the band stop cold. This song wasn't for Priscilla. Not really. James Burton felt his heart drop. That wasn't part of the show. That wasn't part of any show Elvis had ever done. The stage lights flickered gently as if even the electricity paused to listen. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. They looked at each other, not sure if they'd heard correctly. Not for Priscilla? That alone was enough to shake the room. Everyone knew the story, or they thought they did. The backup singers froze mid-breath, unsure whether to continue the intro or wait. Elvis didn't give a cue. He just stared at the floor, almost as if he were seeing a memory play out beneath him. What memory was strong enough to stop the king mid-song? Security Chief Dick Grobb stepped closer to the stage, scanning Elvis's face. He'd seen Elvis push through pain, exhaustion, and heartbreak before, but never this kind of trembling honesty. Dick whispered to an usher, "Stay close. Something's happening." No one knew if this was the start of a breakdown or the start of a confession. A man near the back, Ricky Dalton, a bootleg tape collector, lifted his recorder a little higher. He felt something coming, something he would later swear changed the way he saw Elvis forever. The tape hissed softly, picking up every crackle in Elvis's voice. Elvis lifted his head. His eyes glistened. His throat tightened. When he spoke again, his voice barely carried through the mic. "It was someone else. Someone I should have fought harder for." The crowd gasped. A ripple of shock rolled from the front row to the balcony like a wave hitting every seat. People looked at each other with wide, confused eyes. Someone whispered, "Who?" Another whispered, "Why now?" And somewhere above, a camera clicked in the silence. Elvis pressed a hand against his stomach, as if steadying himself. He looked out into the crowd, not searching for applause, but searching for courage. Why do we hide certain truths for so long? And what finally pushes us to let them out? The room tightened with tension. The band waited. The audience waited. Even the air seemed to wait. Elvis swallowed hard. And then, soft enough that only the front rows heard, he said the name. A name that wasn't Priscilla's. A name they never expected. A name that changed everything. For a moment, no one knew how to react. The name Elvis whispered, soft, trembling, and filled with years of regret, hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried a weight that made the entire showroom feel smaller. People in the front row froze, eyes wide, not daring to repeat what they heard. The band members exchanged silent glances. James Burton's fingers hovered above his strings, unsure whether to keep playing or step back. Security Chief Dick Grobb shifted again, inching closer to the side stairs. He looked up at Elvis, reading his face. This wasn't a stage act. It wasn't a dramatic pause for effect. This was something breaking open, something Elvis had kept locked away for too long. Dick whispered into his mic, "Stay alert. He's not following the set." But no one dared interrupt him. Even security felt the truth pressing at the air. The crowd waited for Elvis to speak again. The tension felt sharp, almost electric. A whisper traveled across the balcony. "Did he really say that?" Another voice replied, "Why would he admit it now?" The Hilton showroom, always loud and alive, now pulsed with raw uncertainty. What truth forces a man to speak when silence once protected him? Elvis exhaled shakily. His shoulders lowered. His hand found the note in his pocket again, pressing against it as if it were the last piece of strength he had left. He looked out into the audience, into the blur of glowing faces, silver jewelry catching the stage lights, scarves swaying slightly with each breath. He wiped his brow. His voice tightened. "I let someone down," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "Someone who never deserved it." A woman in the fourth row covered her mouth. A man clasped his hands as if praying. The room wasn't watching a superstar anymore. They were watching a human being trying to climb out from under a mountain of guilt. James stepped forward, gently hitting one soft chord on his guitar. Testing, offering, hoping to guide Elvis back into the song. Elvis didn't respond. He stared at his shoes, the stage lights shining over him like a spotlight on someone who never expected to be caught in this kind of moment. Why do the truths we bury fight the hardest to escape when the world is watching? Then something shifted. Elvis straightened slightly, lifted his head, and looked at James. His eyes weren't steady, but they were determined. He shook his head. Not yet. Not the song. Not until he got this out. A slight murmur rippled across the audience. People gripped their seats, waiting, listening, hoping. The air felt tight again. Elvis raised the mic to his lips. "I thought fame would fix everything," he said quietly. "But sometimes it just drowns out the voices you should have listened to most." James blinked hard. He knew who Elvis meant. Maybe not the name itself, but the type of person. The kind you remember at your worst moments. The kind whose absence hurts louder than applause ever could. Ricky Dalton's recorder hissed softly, capturing each crack in Elvis's voice. That bootleg would later become one of the most whispered-about tapes among die-hard fans. Some believed it proved Elvis was singing from a place of pure truth that night. Others refused to believe he'd expose such a personal wound on stage. But he did, and the stakes were rising. Someone in the balcony whispered, "Is he okay?" Another voice said, "He looks like he's about to fall apart." Elvis looked out again, searching the crowd for something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe strength, maybe the memory of the person he'd let slip away. Then he spoke a line that hit the room like a silent explosion. "I should have fought for her." Gasps spread. Shoulders tensed. A wave of emotion rippled through the rows beneath the golden chandeliers. And before anyone could recover, Elvis lifted his hand and asked the band to restart the song. But slower, like a confession. The band hesitated. Slowing down a song this iconic, this emotional, wasn't something they ever did on the fly. But the look in Elvis's eyes erased every rule they usually followed. James Burton nodded to the others, lifted his guitar, and let the first soft, stretched-out chord slide across the room like a breath finally being released. The lights dimmed again, dipping the showroom into a warm, shadowed amber glow. It felt like someone had taken a giant hand and gently pressed it against the crowd, asking them to stay still, to listen, to feel. Even the soft hum of the air conditioner seemed to quiet down. Elvis stepped closer to the mic. His breath trembled. When he opened his mouth, the first line didn't float out like a polished performance. It cracked. It broke. It spilled. Maybe I didn't treat you quite as good as I should have." The sound wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. But it was real. So real that people in the front rows instinctively leaned forward, as if they were hearing the song for the very first time. What would you have done if you watched someone you admired fall apart so honestly right in front of you? A soft gasp rolled through the audience. Couples held hands. Strangers looked at each other, eyes glistening. The chandeliers reflected tiny dots of gold across the balcony, and the whole room seemed trapped inside the moment with him. He wasn't Elvis the legend anymore. He was just a man singing to someone who couldn't hear him, someone who lived only in memory. James listened carefully. Elvis wasn't singing to the crowd. Every note sounded like a message being delivered to that one woman, the one whose name had shattered the room minutes earlier. This wasn't entertainment. It was confession. He closed his eyes. His voice softened even more. "And maybe I didn't love you quite as often as I could have." Short, broken breaths slipped between the words. His shoulders trembled. The spotlight flickered gently, casting shadows that made him look even more human, more vulnerable, more trapped between the past and the present. Then came the pattern-breaker moment, the one Ricky Dalton's bootleg captured so clearly that fans still whisper about it decades later. Elvis stopped singing. Mid-line, mid-breath, mid-memory. He gripped the mic stand. His knees bent slightly. A wave of pain crossed his face, and he whispered, barely audible, "God, I'm sorry." Those 3 words punched through the silence like a heartbeat returning after years of stillness. People covered their mouths. A man in the balcony wiped his eyes quickly, pretending he wasn't crying. The room held its breath again, afraid to exhale and break whatever fragile honesty Elvis had let out. He opened his eyes again, wet, shimmering under the lights, and kept singing. Softer, deeper. Every lyric fell heavy, like pieces of a truth he should have spoken long before this night. Why do we save our rawest honesty for moments when it's almost too late? By the time he reached the final lines, his voice steadied just enough to carry the note. But it didn't sound like forgiveness. It sounded like surrender. The band let the last chords fade into the dark like smoke drifting upward. Elvis reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded note. Slowly, carefully he opened it, and the stage lights caught the name written in fading blue ink. The note shook slightly in Elvis's hands. The thin paper looked fragile, almost transparent under the golden stage lights. The crowd leaned forward as if they could somehow read the faded blue ink from their seats. But Elvis didn't show the name. He only stared at it for a long, trembling moment. Then he folded it back with the same gentle care someone gives to a memory they aren't ready to let go of. No one clapped. No one even moved. The silence felt alive, a living thing stretching across the massive Las Vegas Hilton showroom. And then, something strange happened. Something James Burton said he'd never seen in all the years he stood behind Elvis. The entire crowd rose to their feet, but not in an explosive ovation, not in the typical roar of excitement. They stood slowly, almost cautiously, like they were afraid of breaking him. 20,000 people rising in complete silence, hands pressed together, eyes glistening. What would you do if you saw someone's heart open like that? Right in front of you. A woman in the third row stepped forward and placed a single white rose at the edge of the stage. Elvis saw her. He nodded, touched his chest, and whispered a soft thank you. His voice barely carried, but she heard it. Everyone did. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. For so long, he had been carrying a kind of grief that fame couldn't hide, applause couldn't drown, and time couldn't erase. Tonight, the crowd didn't ask for the superstar. They didn't want the legend. They wanted the man, the one who had tried, failed, loved imperfectly, and hurt quietly. Isn't it strange how compassion from strangers can sometimes heal wounds the people closest to us never could? When the band stepped forward to check on him, Elvis shook his head gently. He wasn't collapsing. He wasn't retreating. He was finally letting something go. The weight that had followed him like a shadow began to lift, piece by piece, as he looked out at the people who loved him not for perfection, but for honesty. He took the mic again. His voice steadied. "I should have told her the truth," he said softly. "And maybe it's too late now, but I can't pretend anymore." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few quiet cries echoed from the balcony. Even Dick Grobb, tough as he was, swallowed hard as he watched Elvis reclaim a part of himself he'd hidden away for years. After the show, Elvis didn't retreat to his dressing room like usual. He walked backstage with a new kind of calm, like someone who had finally opened a window in a dark room. James placed a hand on his shoulder. Elvis didn't speak at first. He just looked down the hallway, eyes thoughtful. "I need to make some calls," he finally said. And he did. That night, long after the crowd had left, long after the lights dimmed and the tape recorders turned off, Elvis started reaching out to people he had drifted from. Friends, old confidants, family whose relationships had weathered too many storms. He apologized. He listened. He asked for forgiveness that many were ready to give. The confessions on stage had unlocked something he'd kept silent for far too long. Marie Chenoweth, the woman who placed the rose on the stage, later wrote in her diary that she'd never forget the look in his eyes. Like someone who had been holding his breath for years, finally exhaling. Why does it sometimes take a breaking point for us to finally open our hearts? And what possibilities appear the moment we stop hiding behind who we think we're supposed to be? As the night ended and the show workers cleared the final cables, Elvis held the folded note one last time before slipping it gently into his jacket pocket. He didn't tear it. He didn't throw it away. He just held it close and walked into the quiet Las Vegas night. But the impact of that confession wasn't finished. Not even close. In the months that followed, people kept whispering about that December night at the Las Vegas Hilton. Fans replayed their memories again and again, trying to make sense of the moment when Elvis Presley, America's untouchable icon, let the world see the part of him that fame had buried. Even long after the lights faded, even after the final encore of his career, that night stayed alive like an echo no one could silence. Word spread fast. Someone claimed they'd heard the whispered name clearly. Someone else said they only caught part of it. Bootleg collectors traded Ricky Dalton's tape like a secret treasure, its soft hiss and crackle capturing not just Elvis's voice, but his heart. Was it possible that one confession could change the way an entire world understood a man they never truly knew? When Elvis passed away in August of 1977, people didn't just mourn him. They revisited every lyric, every interview, every hidden moment. Reporters dug through archives, trying to trace the story behind that mysterious name. Old friends spoke gently about a woman from his early life, a quiet relationship before fame wrapped itself around him, a love not loud enough for headlines, but real enough to haunt him long after the spotlight found his face. Decades later, in Tupelo, a small group of devoted fans placed a simple plaque on the side of a chapel wall. It wasn't official. It wasn't flashy. It didn't mention a name. It just read, "For the one who was always on his mind." Visitors still touched the plaque softly, the way people touch sacred things. Why does a single emotional truth outlive the person who spoke it? And how does vulnerability carve itself into history so deeply? Marie Chenoweth, the woman who placed the white rose on the stage, kept a diary for the rest of her life. One entry, found by her daughter decades later, said, "I think he was trying to save himself that night, and maybe, in a way, he did." Her words were written in dark blue ink, much like the ink on the folded note Elvis carried. James Burton would occasionally talk about that night in interviews. He never revealed the name, but he always said the same thing. It wasn't about scandal. It was about regret. He was talking to someone who mattered before the world knew his name. And the tapes, the diaries, the whispers, they kept the mystery alive. Fans debated. Some said the name belonged to a childhood sweetheart. Others insisted it was someone Elvis met early in his career, before fame pushed her out of reach. And some believed it didn't matter who she was, but why he remembered her. Because sometimes the people we lose become the people we think about the most. Sometimes a single regret becomes the quiet engine that runs the rest of our lives. Even now, when the song "Always on My Mind" plays on late-night radio, people who know the legend listen differently. They listen for the tremble in his voice. They listen for the apology hidden between the lines. They listen for the man on stage holding a note that meant more than the whole world ever could. And deep down they wonder, who was she? And why did she stay in his heart for the rest of his life? Years after Elvis was gone, people still talked about that night. Not because of the set list, not because of the outfit, not because of the crowd size. They talked about the moment the mask slipped, and the man behind the legend finally spoke from the softest part of his heart. In a world that had built him into a symbol, he dared to sound human. And somehow, that honesty outshined every spotlight he ever stood beneath. His confession didn't end with an answer, it opened a question. One that fans still whisper about to this day. Who was she? The mysterious woman behind the name he whispered on that December evening? The truth is simple and painful at the same time. She was someone he couldn't forget, someone he didn't fight hard enough to keep, and someone whose absence left a space in his heart that even applause couldn't fill. But maybe the name wasn't the point. Maybe the point was the regret, the longing, the truth he had pushed aside until it finally found its way onto a stage in front of 20,000 people. Have you ever felt that way about someone? Someone you should have held on to when you had the chance? Someone you think about years later, wondering how things might have been different if you just said what you felt while you still had time? What Elvis showed us was something rare, that even the brightest stars carry shadows. Even the strongest voices tremble when they face the truths they've ignored. And even legends have unfinished stories. His confession wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. It was a man trying to heal a wound that had never stopped hurting. The crowd didn't cheer to celebrate him. They rose because they understood him. They saw a reflection of themselves in his vulnerability. Every missed chance, every unspoken apology, every moment where pride won over love. For once, the story wasn't about Elvis the superstar. It was about Elvis the human being. Ricky Dalton, the man with the bootleg recorder, later said that the tape captured more than sound. It captured a feeling, a tremble, a heartbeat, a truth finally escaping after years of silence. Fans who heard that tape said it changed the way they understood the song. It wasn't just a ballad anymore. It was a confession set to music. And that's why Always on My Mind still hits so deeply today. Not because of the melody, not even because of the lyrics, but because listeners can sense the weight behind it, the apology, the longing, the ghost of a love he couldn't forget. Isn't it strange how one song can feel like someone holding out their heart, hoping someone will finally understand? Years later, when fans visit the small chapel wall in Tupelo where the plaque was placed, they run their fingers across the engraved words. For the one who was always on his mind. Some take pictures, some leave flowers, and some just stand there quietly, thinking about the people they lost along the way. Because at its core, this story isn't about fame or mystery. It's about the fragile threads that tie people together, and how easily those threads can break. It's about the regret that follows us, the apologies we wish we'd given sooner, and the memories that refuse to fade, no matter how many years pass. Elvis taught us that love doesn't disappear just because time moves forward, and regret doesn't fade just because we pretend it isn't there. His voice cracked that night because he wasn't singing to an audience. He was singing to someone who lived only in his memory. Maybe that's why his confession mattered. Maybe that's why it still echoes. And maybe that's why, when the song plays, people close their eyes and wonder who's always on their mind. If the story touched you, share it with someone who still thinks about a person they once loved and lost. Maybe they'll hear something in Elvis's voice that reminds them of their own unfinished story. And if you have a memory of that song or that era, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your part of the legend.